Thank you, Anton. We have time for a few questions, and I would ask everyone to present himself and to be concise. Please.
How is the assessment from the Russian point of view, North Korea compared with Iran? Because Iran is on the border, has even Central Asia, and even planned to bomb your radar in Azerbaijan in 2007. And to Professor Johnson, what are the nuclear ambitions of Brazil and Venezuela, please?
Yes, Bruno Tertrais, Fares. A quick comment, two quick comments and a quick question. Comment for Rebecca. I find it objectionable from a moral standpoint to insert the picture of a starving African child on a slide devoted to the ethics and morality of nuclear deterrence, which is an issue that I'm sure that we respectfully disagree upon, and we will continue to respectfully disagree. I was shocked by that photograph. Otherwise, your presentation was very informative and even illuminating in other respects. Another comment is for Anton. I think you are gravely underestimating the magnitude of the change that happened in the years 1979 to 1983 on Iran's nuclear policy. You are grossly overestimating the elements of continuity and grossly underestimating how much the Shah wanted, first and foremost, to be a Western country. And because he wanted to be Westernized, he actually deliberately refrained from any activity that would lead Iran on the military nuclear path. His ideal might have been for one day Iran to become a nuclear power, but I'm talking actions, I'm not talking intentions. And I personally do not remember any significant undeclared activities around 77, but maybe I'm mistaken. But I think you are underestimating the difference between them. Finally, my question, sorry, that's to you, Anton. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Russian position on the state-level safeguards?
All right, the last one, Michael, please.
Yes, Michael Knock from Berkeley. Enjoyed the presentations all very much. One quick comment, actually, but inviting your comment to Emily, and one quick comment to Anton. Sorry, sat with Rebecca at lunch. On Emily's, I think that what you presented is an understandable perspective. But when Obama entered office, the idea was to have a kind of nuclear architecture that both you and I have discussed, and have separate explicit tracks on Iran and North Korea. And Dennis Ross was appointed to be a special emissary on Iran. Steve Bosworth was a long-time negotiator and dean of the Fletcher School for North Korea. And that was pursued full blast at the top of the priority list from the beginning. It was never not looked at, never secondary. It was high priority. The problem was lack of progress. There were many, and the point is, when you have a special emissary, at least for the U.S., it's put in a separate intelligence channel. It's highly compartmented. Very few people, even senior people in the government, had access to that channel, to be controlled by the White House. In fact, Ross had troubles in the State Department, so he was shifted over to the White House. And then he left, and Bosworth left, because it was harder to get things done than I think at least the President had hoped. In fact, the more general point is, I think the President was disappointed in his own inability to both persuade the Republicans, to persuade the Russians, to persuade the Chinese. I think he had more confidence in his persuasive powers than was achieved. And therefore, they had to keep rethinking and revising. Also, on North Korea, there's a whole separate matter of so-called independent actors. I mean, remember Clinton went to North Korea to get some journalists out, and he had discussions with the North Koreans. Carter went there. Bill Richardson's been there several times. There were several other quasi-governmental, non-governmental efforts made, but no progress. And in the meantime, the U.S. had to continuously reassure the Japanese and the South Koreans, we're with you, we're paying attention. This whole extended deterrence issue had to. So anyway, I would just add that point. On Anton, I think the issue on the CTBT, when Obama came in, actually, I think Vice President Biden was a keen proponent of going forward with the CTBT. Again, the problem there is actually more domestic politics. 67 votes needed to ratify. Today, 53 Democrats, 2 independents who vote with the Democrats. So it's 55-45 today in the Senate. And it was less last time. He doesn't have the votes. And on technical grounds, there remains an argument which helped defeat it last time, that very, very sophisticated low-yield tests by the Russians or by the Chinese cannot be detected by U.S. satellites, intelligence apparatus, national technical means, and so forth. So there's a strong body of reservation about the CTBT, which would be mounted in an effort like that. And based upon recent conversations and stuff in the press, it appears that the President is very leery of presenting treaties of any kind to this Senate because it's gigantically time-consuming and he doesn't know that he'll have the votes. So it's not on the merits of it, but it's on more the politics. Although there is this low-yield issue that remains and was critical in 1999. But happy for you to correct my corrections at any time.
Okay, we'll start with Emily.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to have to go out for a minute for administrative things, but I wanted to comment on your comment. First of all, thank you very much for the comment. And I mean, that was sort of my point, that it was clear that this administration was putting a lot of energy into dealing with Iran and North Korea. My point was, or my, not criticism, but my comment went more to the conceptual issue of how you define your arms control agenda. And what was coming out at the forefront of, this is the administration's arms control / disarmament agenda, Iran and North Korea weren't integrated, really, in that agenda. We were hearing more about the global treaties, less about that. So it wasn't that they weren't being taken care of, but I think the fact that they weren't integrated in that agenda in the first place, because that's the major challenge to the nonproliferation regime today. So you would see an agenda for arms control and nonproliferation. It would say that in the title, and you wouldn't see Iran and North Korea there. And that's what I think led to some, additional problems. For example, Syria. Because if nonproliferation as a concept is not integrated in the way I think it should have been, then it's just Iran and North Korea that you're dealing with. But you're not dealing with nonproliferation, so clearly if you have another challenge, it will go in that same category. So Syria would have gone right into that category and would have been dealt with along with Iran and North Korea. So what I was trying to say is the conceptual issue has real implications, even though I'm very clear about the fact that this administration was very determined to deal with those two nonproliferation challenges. So that was sort of the point. So I don't disagree with your comment. I mean, I agree with it, but it's just sort of the framing of the issue that I think we need to understand there are implications to that. When we don't see those challenges on the agenda, that was sort of my point.
I think that was considered and rejected on the grounds that dealing with North Korea
In this broader arms control disarmament venue would not produce anything meaningful on North Korea, because the only thing that matters from an American perspective is to get the Chinese to assist. And the only way you can get the Chinese to assist is through bilateral discussions with the Chinese. And totally separately, if we provided arms to Taiwan today, the Chinese would tell us to go jump in the lake tomorrow on North Korea, because it involves all kinds of other issues. If we said that they're currency manipulators today, they wouldn't press the North Koreans tomorrow. So it's all part of the mosaic of U.S.-China relations, not part of
the nonproliferation.
Right.
Okay.
And the same thing on Iran.
Don?
few points. First, I mean, on Azerbaijan, this is not an issue. Radar in Azerbaijan, this is not an issue anymore because Russia and Azerbaijan agreed not to continue cooperation, so Russia do not use it anymore. On the threats from how Russia sees challenges from Iranian North Korean side, for sure, in Moscow people quite concerned about that. And I should mention that it was the case in 70s when Iran started nuclear technology development, when, for example, was negotiations between France and Iran to sell reprocessing facility. Soviet MFA sent official note to MFA of France with the kind of request to stop this kind of cooperation because Soviet Union was concerned. Just have a look on the Russian Foreign Intelligence Report, which is a public one, which is available on the internet from 1993. It is clear mention that Iran has some nuclear activity which could have military application. It's, I mean, formulated very in a diplomatic way, but the signal is quite clear. So Russia has some concerns, and one of the reasons which Russian officials mentioned in 90s why we need cooperate on Bushehr to better understand what is going on in Iran, I think it's failed. Because in spite of the fact that Russia was building Bushehr, Russia had no idea about Natanz, Fordow, which is unfortunate. So from that point of view, cooperation on Bushehr was useless. But there were other reasons to cooperate on Bushehr. So Russia has concern about that. And of course, Natanz facility and Fordow facility especially undermine, I would say, Russia's dialogue with Iranians and Russian exchanges with Iranians on different types of nuclear issues quite significantly. Again, especially Fordow, the last case. And for example, if it's an open secret that Iranians offered continued cooperation on Bushehr II. And I don't see much interest from the Russian side for many reasons. Part of them because still a lot of work to be done, first of all, between IAEA and Iran. On North Korea, it's about the same, but we should recognize that North Korea tested 3 times. Do they have actual weapon, actual device? I think most likely they have just device which could not be put on the delivery vehicles. At least this is my understanding. But of course people feel threatened because, I mean, especially when it was about missile launches. It was not far from our borders. And even there was some, I mean, exercises in the Russian Far East, how Russia should react if some massive protests and, I mean, unrest is going on inside North Korea. So there are some concerns about that. On Iran undeclared nuclear activity, Bruno, I think you are quite right about Shah approach and Shah vision. But first, we should keep in mind that one of the goals during the Shah time in the nuclear field for Iran was to avoid cooperation, I mean in the peaceful use, with both superpowers, with the United States and Russia. So one of the goals of the Iran when they launched this ambitious program to build 23 gigawatt of nuclear power was to avoid cooperation, actually avoid cooperation with the United States and Russia, and rely mostly on Europeans, France, Germany, and UK, because UK at that time was going to switch its focus from Magnox reactor, so-called Magnox reactor, to light water reactor. I know well that the first research reactor was delivered by Americans. There was some other cooperation, for example, in training, and Iranians like to train their specialists in the US, but Iranians were trained to avoid cooperation, the peaceful use with Americans. But one of the reasons for Iranian nuclear leadership that time to start this undeclared activity was exactly an exchange with Shah. Shah mentioned that in the future he did not exclude. And the technical people, some of them I have interviewed, they told me, okay, Shah will call me a few years later and say, okay, I made a decision, we need a nuke. So when you could make it? And so technical people started preparations to get all necessary technologies, what they need. And their point is quite clear. I mean, we are not we are not politicians, we are technical people. If His Majesty once called us and said that he made a decision, so we have to deliver. So it was their reasons to start undeclared nuclear activities again in 70s. On state-level safeguards, I don't think that there is a major problem of Russia, I mean, with the general approach. As usual, the devil is in details. I mean, what are the criteria? For example, how we will treat South Korea. Recently, it is, I mean, my point that it's violated its safeguards obligation when they use laser enrichment. But it was not reported to the Security Council, and I mean, it was a kind of quiet deal. Will they consider differently from Syria, for example? And some other, I mean, issues, how this system will work. So again, my point that all this drama which is presented or promoted through the media, for publication, including by Mark Hibbs, whom I respect a lot, but I don't think that he's quite right on this particular issue. I don't think that Russia has changed its mind on importance of safeguards. Again, I think that finally IE and Russia, and I know that there are some other formats to discuss this, will lead to a final agreement. So I will think that diplomats and technical experts could well negotiate that and find a decision. Professor Nacht, on your question, there is an issue, and I think people in Moscow recognize that small yield, and people in Moscow recognize that, especially from the Republican side, there are concerns about that. But at the same time, I think the treaty written in a way which provide us with an opportunity to keep this question with no answer, I would put it in this way. So I think that I don't see much interest from the Russian government side to rephrase the language of the treaty with this particular issue. And I mean, there is a respect from and recognition from the Russian side that this is, first of all, domestic issue. We know well how much U.S. spent funds for CTBTO, for sensors network development. But again, I think with no CTBT ratification in Washington, it will be quite difficult to reach progress in this particular field. So this is why it's so important from my point of view to make it as the priority for the Obama administration for the second term. And I think that people in Moscow are quite optimistic about bilateral cooperation, even in general, but in non-proliferation field particular. Again, all these reports from the media about non-Lugar program, Russia is not interested to continue, to stop everything, just quite far from the reality. It goes without saying that Russia is interested in a new legal base, which partially has already been established during the recent years. 123 agreement is one of them, quite important. But again, in general, there is no interest from the Russian side to stop any cooperation.
Thank you. Rebecca, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I found it very objectionable as well, Bruno. Very shocking. But as a scientist, when I read those studies that have updated the nuclear winter studies of the 1980s with scenarios that looked at just a very limited exchange of nuclear weapons used on cities. They used the baseline possibility of India and Pakistan, but a fraction, not even half of the weapons that they are thought to have, but a fraction of the world's arsenals. It was extremely shocking to see that, because I think since the Cold War ended, we kind of think that, if nuclear weapons are used, it'll destroy the countries that it's used against. Well, that's going to be a humanitarian catastrophe right there and then. But what people have to also recognize, and with new climate studies, because there's a lot more data on climate, it's shown that a small number of nuclear weapons used on cities, and we have very large cities, will send soot up into the atmosphere. It will circulate. You will have a severe and abrupt darkening, cooling effect that will disrupt rainfall, that will therefore disrupt agriculture, that will disrupt food. Now, others have taken that studies and looked at specific crops and specific regions. It will affect the whole world. That's one thing to be very clear. I mean, crops in the US, the maize crop is one of the studies, the rice crop in China, these would be very badly affected. But what we know from the Red Cross and the humanitarian agencies is the worst effects of starvation will happen in the regions and countries that already have food insecurity. That's the reason why there is a picture of a starving African child, because starving African children are on our TV screens because there's food insecurity there already. Africa is a completely nuclear weapon-free zone. So when, we've begun to get African parliamentarians and now increasingly African governments looking at these studies for themselves and commissioning studies to look at the impact of even a limited nuclear exchange of nuclear weapons use on their own countries in Africa. And they have been confirming also, and there's a study by Dr. Ira Helfand, funded by the Swiss, talks about up to 1 billion dead of starvation. Nuclear famine is what he actually calls it, because it's nuclear-induced famine, within about a 10-year period when you would have the worst effects of this climate effect and agricultural collapse. So, this was not just put here for shock. This was put here to make a very serious point, because the NPT regime has rendered those countries that have joined together to make nuclear weapon-free zones, that have got rid of the nuclear weapons from their regions, from their countries and so on, they're the good guys. But under the regime, they are rendered powerless. They have to only be supplicants in the 2010 review conference, or the 25, or the 2000. They can only be supplicants begging the countries that have nuclear weapons, the nuclear armed states, to do something about disarmament. So bringing this new data and new information about the global, not just regional, the global catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe, that would result if any one or any two or few of those 9 nuclear armed countries were, God forbid, to use them, to lose control, to unleash them. This is part of the debate that is changing in international relations, and it is no surprise on this point that 6 out of the 35 countries that joined the N35 statement of the UNGA were from Africa: Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, Sierra Leone, Swaziland, and Zambia. Those are joining that because they want to begin to take some leadership, to take some control over what would be a direct security threat, a direct humanitarian threat for their own people. That's what is changing, and that's why that kind of slide was very necessary. The question there about Brazil and Venezuela. Brazil, we all know, had, along with Argentina, significant ambitions and developed, and has continued to develop all aspects, in effect, of the nuclear fuel cycle. And I think it would be fair to say that they've done that deliberately. They, like Japan did, and indeed like Iran keeps saying it wants to do, however, they have, all of it is under safeguards as far as we know. They certainly took a decision. They were one of the most recent countries to take the decision to sign and ratify the NPT. They are an NPT state in very good standing. But as part of, frankly, they were also a leading member of the New Agenda Coalition. They are a leading state within this coalition that is taking the new drive for nuclear disarmament, and that is a geostrategic decision on their part. They, in a sense, they have the aspects of the fuel cycle that they could develop nuclear weapons. They also have, of course, a missile development, space program, etc. They could, if they chose. I think it's very clear from their politics that they don't want to, that they would much rather that the world would move to disarmament. But I've had very frank discussions with some Brazilian diplomats where, frankly, they said they wonder whether they made the right decision. They made their decision to join the NPT before India tested. They think maybe they'd have more leverage for nuclear disarmament and more leverage geopolitically if they had crossed that line. But they don't want to cross that line now. They're not intending to. I don't think that there's suspicions in terms of the IAEA. But we have to recognize that they are a leading part of a movement that says you can't keep giving strategic value, U.S. nuclear India deals, these U.S.-India nuclear deals, these kinds of things. You can't keep giving them to the countries that stay out of the NPT or indeed, who pull out, like North Korea. Venezuela. I'd have to look into why you asked the question specific to Venezuela, because I've not heard anything specific about the Venezuelan nuclear program to give me cause for concern. So I don't have it. I haven't talked to the Venezuelans recently about their program, and I'll look into that. But I hope that pretty much answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to apologize to those that were eager to ask questions. We have no more time. Thank you all, and please.